Hi, my name is Tom Haddy and I'm the author and the creator of this new educational channel dealing with music. Today I'm looking at the life and works of Phil Spector, one of the musical geniuses of the 20th century. Well, Phil is really famous for his association with the Beatles and the Brill Building, but principally he's famous for his work as a producer. His production technique, the Wall of Sound, is a unique landmark in the history of musical development. Phil Spector developed a production technique called the Wall of Sound, which he used extensively during his career. This technique created a dense, layered effect designed to sound good on AM radio and jukeboxes. So here are the key components of Spector's Wall of Sound. He had large ensembles. He used large groups of musicians to achieve a fuller sound, but it needs to be remembered that he employed many musicians, but they were all world-class musicians. Glenn Campbell, famous singer, was actually a world-class guitarist. Hal Blaine, world-class drummer. These ensembles included instruments not typically used for ensemble playing, like electric and acoustic guitars. He often used multiple instruments playing the same part in unison, doubling or tripling the sound. He also employed complex orchestrations in his arrangements. Now, the musicians in his de facto house band later became known as the Wrecking Crew, and they worked with lots of artists, including, of course, the Beach Boys. Spector typically worked with arrangers like Jack Nitch. Spector used multi-tracking and overdubbing techniques to layer sound. Sometimes he would double track a pair of instruments multiple times. He emphasized the role of mono recording, even though stereo recording was becoming very popular. Spector was a staunch advocate for mono recording. Whether he was defining his brand or whether he genuinely had these reservations about stereo, who knows? He did say he believed that stereo took control away from the producer and gave it to the listener. Spector's Wall of Sound created a distinctive and influential sound that became synonymous with his productions. This technique helped to elevate the recording studio to the status of an instrument in its own right. Of course, that was the point of contention between many artists. For example, Darlene Love, who was one of his backing singers and often sung in his major groups, she felt that her role as an artist, a singer in her own right, was undermined by Phil's insistence that she was just one voice out of many in the recording studio that he had control of. Beyond the Wall of Sound's impact on AM radio, it also contributed to the emergence of art rock and other genres that prioritized aesthetics such as shoegaze and noise music. So we know that he was a member, he worked for many years at the Brill Building. Brill Building was a famous pre-Beatles music factory. Many of the world's great songwriters worked there, including the very famous, there were 11 world famous Jewish songwriters. And Phil Spector was very much part of the team. He worked with Barry Mann and his wife, Jeff Barry and his wife, etc., etc., etc. He also worked with John Lennon. He co-produced the 71 single Power to the People. He produced the album Imagine while he was working as head of A&R for Apple. He also co-produced Lennon's Christmas single Happy Christmas War Was Over and the controversial 72 album Sometime in New York City, both of which were collaborations with Yoko. Spector began work with Lennon on his 75 album Rock and Roll, but about this time Spector was really experiencing very real psychological challenges. His behaviour became extremely erratic. There are episodes of his shooting off guns in recording studios. I think John Lennon came to the point enough is enough. Harrison also worked extensively, Spector worked extensively with Harrison on his classic 1970 triple LP All Things Must Pass. Spector also co-produced the single Bangladesh and live concert for Bangladesh. They began working on Harrison's Living in the Material World, but again, at this time, Spector was experiencing psychological challenges and Harrison just discontinued the arrangement. Yes, Spector did work with Ringo Starr. He co-wrote and produced Ringo's hit song It Don't Come Easy. Spector never worked with Paul McCartney of the Beatles. He did work on, of course, the production of the Beatles LP Let It Be. So Spector produced the Beatles album Let It Be, which was released a month after the band's breakup in 70. This topped the charts in both the US and the UK, included the number one single, The Long and Winding Road. There was some bad feeling between McCartney and Spector. McCartney didn't like Spector's dominance in the recording process and eventually re-recorded his own version. Some people resented the fact that this American producer was apparently taking over a much-loved British band. That wasn't true. Spector played a very important role at a very important time for the Beatles. And Lennon himself defended Spector's work. He pointed out that the quality of the work, Let It Be, was low level compared to some of the Beatles' own estimations of other works, and Spector did a good job. So here are some key factors that shaped Spector's musical innovation and lasting influence. Early influences. Spector was exposed to Latin music and percussion from a young age, which can be heard in many of his recordings. He also drew inspiration from classical music. He often referred to his works as little symphonies for the kids. The wall of sound was obviously synonymous with Spector. This signature production technique involved using large groups of musicians playing orchestrated parts, often doubling and tripling instruments in unison to create a dense, layered sound. He was a great collaborator. He worked at the Brill Building and 1650 Broadway. These were teams of songwriters, including Ellie Greenwich and Jeff Barry, husband and wife. Mann and Cynthia Whale, husband and wife. Mann is still alive, mid-80s. If you've never heard of Barry Mann, I strongly recommend that you do some research into Barry Mann, not only as this world-class songwriter, but also a great artist in his own right. He recently, 2024, maybe 23, he lost his wife, Cynthia Whale. He also worked with Goffin and King, of course. Carole King went on to great fame as an artist. But Spector's approach and his meticulous approach was to recording, and he saw the studio as an instrument in its own right. And this was the point of all the contention between him and many of the artists. They saw their own voices and their guitarmanship and pianomanship as talents and skills. He saw these as bit players in the world of Phil Spector. He worked with the very talented session musicians known as the Wrecking Crew, including, of course, Glenn Campbell, Hal Blaine, many others. Now, what's the significance of his lasting influence? Well, he was the first musical auteur, or he's often referred to as the tycoon of teen. He's often considered the first musical auteur, meaning he exerted creative control over every aspect of the recording process, from songwriting and arrangement to the final mix. His approach was genre bending. His work blurred genre boundaries, blending pop, rock, soul, R&B elements. He pioneered the integration of pop art aesthetics into music, paving the way for art rock and dream pop. He inspired generation. His innovative techniques and signature sound influenced countless musicians and producers, from the Beatles to the Beach Boys to Brian Eno to Tony Visconti. His impact extended to various genres, including shoegaze, noise, alternative rock. The Wall of Sound also influenced artists beyond the US and the UK, including ABBA in Sweden, of course, and city pop musicians in Japan. Despite his lasting legacy, his personal life and later years were marred by erratic behaviour, substance abuse, and ultimately a conviction for murder. This is the darker side of Phil's genius, unfortunately. Now, this is quite lengthy, but we'll pick up some critical points. Okay, Phil Spector, born in 1939. His father committed suicide when he was 9 years of age. The inscription on his tombstone, "To know him was to love him," is critical in Phil's story because that was Phil's first number one hit with the Teddy Bears in 1958. The Teddy Bears weren't successful. They disbanded in 1959. Then Spector meets Lester Sill. Lester Sill was Phil's first mentor. And Lester Sill is often not given the credit for the role that he played in the development of the career of Spector. 60, Spector co-writes Benny King's top hit Spanish Harlem and works as a session musician in New York. 61, he produces Ray Peterson's Corrina and Curtis Lee's Pretty Little Angel Eyes. Now he then joins a twosome with Lester Sill. It's Lester Sill and Phil Spector. You can see the first four letters of Phil's record is Phil. The last three letters is Les. So Phil's records is Phil and Lester. The Crystals became his first act, achieving success with There's No Other Like My Baby and Uptown. Now, 1962, Spector briefly worked as an A&R producer for Liberty Records. He formed Bobby B. Sox and the Blue Jeans. They had a great hit with Zippity Doo Dah and Why Do Lovers Break Each Other's Hearts. He had a great hit with He's a Rebel by the Crystals, one of his girl bands. I think that featured Darlene Love as the signature lead singer. 1963, he released one of his great and one of the world's great pop songs, Be My Baby, and also released his A Christmas Gift for You, which was a Christmas album. 1965, he worked on the Righteous Brothers' You've Lost That Loving Feeling. I think that was written by Phil Spector and also Barry Mann and his wife. 1966, Spector signed Ike and Tina Turner to Phil's Records. Their River Deep Mountain High was a massive hit in the UK, but was not a hit in the United States. That really disappointed Phil. He then went on to marry the lead singer of the Ronettes, Ronnie Bennett. Largely withdrew from the public eye. He then, in 1969, signed a production deal with A&M Records, the Ronettes. You Came, You Saw, You Conquered. It flopped, but he returned to the charts with a great song by Sonny Charles and the Checkmates, Black Pearl. He then worked with Lennon on Instant Karma and worked on the Let It Be album with the Beatles. He also produced George Harrison's triple LP, All Things Must Pass, and John Lennon's Plastic Ono Band. 1971, he became head of A&R Apple Records. He became head of A&R at Apple Records. He produced Lennon's Power to the People and Imagine. He produced George Harrison's Bangladesh and Ronnie Spector's Try Some Buy Some. In 1972, he co-produced John Lennon and Yoko Ono's Happy Christmas War Is Over and the double LP Sometime in New York City. He reissued A Christmas Gift for You from Phil's Records. 1973, he began working with George Harrison on Living in the Material World, but he was dismissed because at this time there were psychological challenges. He was becoming psychologically unwell, progressively so. He did start some recording sessions with John Lennon, but something similar happened. He was overwhelmed with these psychological challenges and he was eventually fired from the project. 1974, he was seriously injured in a car accident, although he did take time to start up Warner Spector Records. 1975, he formed Phil Spector International with Polydor Records. 1977, he worked with Leonard Cohen on a largely forgettable LP called Death of a Ladies' Man. And in 1979, he worked with the Ramones on a largely forgettable LP called End of the Century. In the 80s, 90s, 2000s, he became increasingly reclusive. He did co-produce Yoko Ono's Season of Glass. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1989 and the Songwriters Hall of Fame in 1997. He did contribute to Star Sailor's Silence is Easy in 2003. Then in 2003, there was the tragic death of the American actress Lana Clarkson. And in 2009, Spector started his 19-year prison sentence. He died in 2021. So now we're going to listen to a podcast.
And trust me, it's a wild ride through music history, innovation, and, well, let's just say some seriously dark turns.
Yeah, it really is a fascinating story. You know, you're talking about a guy who completely revolutionized music production, I mean, with his famous wall of sound technique.
Yeah.
But as we'll see, his personal life was, well, anything but harmonious.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Spector's story begins in the Bronx in 1939. Not exactly the glamorous world of music, huh?
Right, not really. And it's kind of striking, you know, how this one tragic event in his childhood really became like intertwined with his musical success. When Spector was 9 years old, his father committed suicide. And the inscription on his father's tombstone, "To know him was to love him," actually later became the title of Spector's first big hit song with his band, the Teddy Bears.
Whoa. That sends chills down my spine just hearing that. You have to wonder how that impacted him, you know, pouring such a personal experience into his music, like, even at such a young age. Speaking of which, he did hit it big pretty early on, didn't he?
Oh, absolutely. To know him is to love him. Topped the charts in 1958. He was only 18 years old at the time. That kind of instant success. It's something most musicians only dream of.
Yeah, it really is. It's like he was destined for music greatness, even from a young age. But he didn't stop at performing, did he? He wanted to be more than just a singer in a band.
Yeah, you're right. He wasn't content with just being part of the music. He wanted to shape the sound of music itself. So after the Teddy Bears, he really honed his production skills. He even learned from the songwriting legends, Jerry Leiber and Mike Stoller. This is where he really cut his teeth, so to speak, before creating his signature sound.
Learning from the best. It's like a masterclass in music production. But didn't he already have a hand in some major hits even before the Wall of Sound? I'm thinking about some of those classics from that era.
Absolutely. He was involved in hits like Benny King's Spanish Harlem and that iconic guitar solo with the Drifters on Broadway. I mean, you can already hear his touch, even in these early productions. He even produced Ray Peterson's Karina, another top 10 hit at the time. So you see, his talent was already shining through.
Yeah, it's like he had this Midas touch, turning everything he worked on into gold. But when did he take that leap to really define his own style, the one that he'd become so well known for?
That came when he started his own record label, Phyllis Records, in 1961. He was only 21 at the time, the youngest label owner in the U.S. at that time. I guess this is where the first tycoon of teen really earned his name. And with this label, he had the freedom to experiment, to create his Wall of Sound.
Ah, the Wall of Sound. I've heard this term a million times, but to be honest with you, I'm not sure I fully grasp what it means. Can you break it down for us? What makes it so unique?
Okay, so imagine this. You walk into a recording studio, and it's packed, not just with musicians, but with tons of instruments. Multiple guitars, pianos, basses, drums, even instruments you wouldn't really expect in a pop song. And they're all playing at the same time, creating this dense, really powerful sound. That's the essence of the Wall of Sound.
So it's more than just loudness, right? There's a real method to the madness, to all those layers. It's not just noise for the sake of noise.
Yeah, exactly. It's about creating this massive orchestral sound. Carefully layered and arranged. He often had different musicians play the same notes, but on different instruments. It creates this really unified, almost symphonic effect. It's like a waves of sound washing over you. Spector even likened it to the grand operas of Wagner.
Wow, now that you explain it like that, I can almost hear it in my head. It's like he was a painter, but instead of colors, he used instruments. He created these sonic masterpieces. But did he develop this technique with a specific purpose in mind? I mean, was it just about creating a new sound, or was it tailored to the way people were listening to music back then?
You hit the nail on the head. The Wall of Sound was perfect for AM radio and jukeboxes. It cut through the static and the limitations of those devices, and it delivered this really intense, immersive listening experience, unlike anything people had heard before.
That's brilliant. It's like he understood the technology of the time and used it to his advantage, making sure his music had maximum impact. And speaking of impact, he used this technique with some of the biggest names in music. Let's talk about those legendary collaborations.
Oh, where do we even begin? Think about the Crystals and hits like He's a Rebel and Then He Kissed Me, or the Ronettes with those unforgettable tracks like Be My Baby, Baby I Love You, and Walking in the Rain. And of course, the Righteous Brothers belting out You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin' and Unchained Melody.
Wow, it's incredible. It's like he had this golden touch, turning these groups into superstars and creating the soundtrack of a generation. But there's got to be more to these hits than just catchy melodies and Spector's production, right? Weren't there some interesting stories behind how those songs came together?
Oh, absolutely. Take He's a Rebel by the Crystals. There was actually a race against time to get that song recorded and released before a competing version could hit the airwaves.
Whoa, wait a minute. A musical showdown. Now that's the story I need to hear. What happened?
Okay, so picture this. Spector finds out that another producer is working on a version of He's a Rebel, but with a different girl group. He knows he has to act fast. So he calls up his musicians, including Darlene Love and the Blossoms, who often sang backup for his girl groups. And they sneak into Gold Star Studios on a Sunday, when it was supposed to be closed.
They pulled off a secret recording session. Talk about dedication.
Yeah, they recorded the entire song in just a few hours.
Yeah.
That's the kind of drive and intensity that Spector was known for. And of course, it paid off big time. He's a Rebel went straight to #1, proving Spector's instincts were spot on.
That's amazing. But not everything he touched was an instant chart topper, was it? I'm thinking about his Christmas album, the one that later became such a classic. But it didn't have an easy start, did it?
You're thinking of A Christmas Gift for You from Phillies Records. Right. It's a beloved Christmas album now. But its release coincided with the assassination of President Kennedy.
Oh, that's right. Just days after that tragedy. Talk about terrible timing. It's remarkable that it managed to overcome that and become such a holiday tradition. Shows that Spector's talents went beyond just those teen anthems. He could create those grand orchestral soundscapes that really captured the spirit of Christmas. But speaking of albums that didn't get the love they deserved at first, there's another one we have to talk about. His work with Ike and Tina Turner. A song that Spector himself considered one of his best.
You're talking about River Deep Mountain High, right? And you're absolutely right. This powerful track sadly flopped in the U.S. It barely scraped the Billboard Hot 100.
That's hard to believe. What went wrong? Was America just not ready for that kind of sound?
It's a bit of a mystery, really. The song was a massive hit in Britain. It reached number 3 on the charts. But for whatever reason, it just didn't connect with American audiences at the time. Some critics speculate that it might have been too musically sophisticated for the pop charts back then. Or maybe, as you suggested, America just wasn't ready for it. Whatever the reason, Spector was really deeply disappointed by its failure here. And it added to his growing disillusionment with the music industry.
It makes you wonder how many other incredible songs might have been overlooked simply because they were ahead of their time. It's a good reminder to keep an open mind and revisit music from different eras. But before we go down that rabbit hole, we have to talk about Spector's collaborations with some of the biggest names in music history, the Beatles.
Ah, yes, this is where things start to get really interesting. I mean, this is where Spector's story takes like a dramatic turn, moving from those vibrant 60s into a new decade and a new chapter of his career. You know, after a period of relative seclusion in the late 60s, and during which, by the way, he married Ronnie Bennett, the lead singer of the Ronettes. Spector was brought back into the limelight by none other than Alan Klein, the Beatles' manager.
Right. And his first project with the Beatles was their Let It Be album. I remember hearing there was some controversy surrounding his involvement in the project.
Yeah, that's putting it mildly. The Let It Be recordings were, well, shall we say, bit of a mess.
Yeah.
The band was on the verge of breaking up, and the sessions were filled with tension. So Spector was brought in to try and salvage the project. And true to his style, he added a signature wall of sound touches.
Wow, so he was stepping into a pressure cooker situation. And how did the Fab Four react to his production choices?
Well, it was kind of a mixed bag. John Lennon was a big fan of Spector's work. He praised his ability to create something out of what he called the shittiest load of badly recorded shit. But Paul McCartney, on the other hand, well, he was notoriously unhappy with Spector's additions, especially on his song, The Long and Winding Road.
Oh, I can imagine. Paul is known for his meticulous approach to songwriting and production. What didn't he like about Spector's work on this song?
Well, he felt that Spector's additions were over the top, and that they kind of took away from the song's original simplicity. To fully understand this, we have to talk about overdubbing, which is basically where you add extra instrumental or vocal tracks on top of the original recording.
Ah, okay, so overdubbing was at the heart of the issue. And in this case, it seems like it caused some tension between Spector and McCartney.
Exactly. While overdubbing wasn't new, it was Spector's extensive use of it on The Long and Winding Road, adding all those layers of strings and horns. That McCartney felt was just too much. He even tried to get Spector to remove them, but by then it was too late. The album had already been released.
Wow, that's a fascinating glimpse behind the scenes of one of music's most iconic albums. It just goes to show that even with legendary artists like the Beatles, creative differences can lead to clashes.
Absolutely. But despite all the controversy, Let It Be went on to become a massive hit, topping charts worldwide.
Yeah.
It's still a fascinating album, even with all its quirks. And it really marked a new phase in Spector's career, working with these established solo artists.
Right. And speaking of solo artists, his work with the Beatles didn't stop at Let It Be. Didn't he go on to produce solo albums for both John Lennon and George Harrison?
He did. And those collaborations are really worth exploring in their own right. Each one showcases different aspects of Spector's talents and how he adapted his style to suit the artists he was working with.
This is where it gets really interesting for me. What can you tell us about those albums and how they differed from his previous work?
Okay, so let's start with George Harrison's All Things Must Pass. This album is like a perfect example of Spector's ability to create these grand, sweeping soundscapes. It's like a sonic tapestry of guitars, sitars, vocals, and orchestral arrangements, all expertly woven together by Spector.
Wow, I can already picture it. All Things Must Pass is considered one of Harrison's best solo works. And Spector's production definitely plays a big role in its success. But I remember reading that he also worked on John Lennon's Imagine, right?
That's right, he did. But his approach on Imagine was completely different. While All Things Must Pass is grand and epic in scope, Imagine is much more intimate and introspective. Spector's role here was much more subdued. He added subtle touches to enhance the album's overall sound, without really overwhelming the songs themselves.
So two very different albums, showcasing Spector's versatility as a producer. He could work with all these different artists, different genres, and still create something unique. It's like he had this musical chameleon-like quality.
Exactly. And his work with John Lennon and George Harrison, it really solidified his status as one of the most important producers of that era. He had this incredible ability to adapt his style to fit the artist and the material. But unfortunately, as we know, Spector's story takes a much darker turn later in his career.
You're right. Despite all his musical genius, Spector was a deeply troubled man. There were troubling allegations of gun use during recording sessions, and his behavior became increasingly erratic.
Yeah, precisely. And these incidents kind of foreshadowed the tragic events that would ultimately lead to his downfall. But before we delve into that darker side, let's take a moment to really appreciate the incredible impact he had on music during those early years. From shaping the sound of the 60s with his wall of sound to working with music legends like the Beatles. He left an indelible mark on the world of music.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that even the most brilliant minds can be plagued by personal demons. And that fame and success, well, they don't always bring happiness. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll take a closer look at the events that led to Spector's downfall, exploring the complexities of his character and the tragic consequences of his actions.
Yeah, it's a difficult but important part of his story, and it raises questions about how we reconcile the art with the artist, especially when dealing with such a complex and troubled figure like Phil Spector. As we move further into Phil Spector's story, you really start to see how his musical brilliance is often kind of overshadowed by his personal struggles. Even during his peak in the 1960s, there were already signs of trouble brewing beneath the surface.
It's like a classic tale of genius and madness, right? The incredible talent, the drive for perfection, but also these inner demons that eventually take over.
Yeah, exactly. And in Spector's case, those demons manifested in increasingly erratic behavior, fueled by substance abuse, and a pretty volatile personality. I mean, there were stories circulating about his temper, and even reports of him brandishing guns during recording sessions.
It's hard to imagine someone so creative could also be so destructive. Was there anything in his personal life that might have contributed to this downward spiral?
Well, his relationship with Ronnie Spector, the lead singer of the Ronettes, whom he married in 1968, was particularly tumultuous. She later revealed years of alleged abuse and psychological torment, claiming he was incredibly controlling and kept her practically a prisoner in their home.
That's heartbreaking. It's a stark reminder that behind the glitz and glamour of those hit records, there were real people dealing with very real pain.
Absolutely. And it seems that as time went on, Spector retreated further into himself, becoming increasingly reclusive. He withdrew from the music industry for these extended periods, almost like he's trying to escape from his own demons.
Yeah, it's like he built his own wall of silence around himself, the opposite of his famous wall of sound. And when he did reemerge, it was often with these bursts of creative energy, but also with those troubling behaviors becoming even more pronounced. His work with Leonard Cohen on the Death of a Ladies' Man album in 1977 is a good example of that, right?
It is. Cohen himself described the final product as grotesque, although he admitted there were some redeeming qualities to the album. But the recording sessions were chaotic, to say the least, with Spector's unpredictable behavior, creating a tense and really difficult atmosphere for everyone involved.
I can only imagine. It sounds like trying to create music in the middle of a hurricane, and then a few years later he worked with the Ramones on their End of the Century album. I've heard some wild stories about those sessions, too. Weren't there even more incidents involving guns?
Yes, unfortunately. Those sessions have become notorious for all the wrong reasons. There are accounts of Spector actually bringing guns into the studio, creating this atmosphere of fear and intimidation for the band members.
It's shocking that this kind of behavior was tolerated, especially considering the danger it posed to everyone present. Why do you think people put up with it?
Well, that's part of the enigma of Phil Spector. I mean, he had cultivated this image of an eccentric genius. And many in the music industry, well, they were willing to kind of overlook his darker side because of his undeniable talent. They were essentially enabling his behavior by making excuses for him.
It's a cautionary tale, for sure. And tragically, his downward spiral continued. In the early 1980s, he produced Yoko Ono's Season of Glass album, which, considering the circumstances surrounding its creation, John Lennon had just been murdered, is a very emotionally charged work. And then it seems like he vanished from the music scene once again.
Yeah, that's right. He had a few brief moments back in the spotlight, a cameo appearance in the film Easy Rider, an unsuccessful attempt to collaborate with Celine Dion, but for the most part, he remained a recluse, battling his personal demons and fading further from public view.
Until that night in 2003, when everything changed, actress Lana Clarkson was found dead in his home, and Spector was charged with her murder.
Yeah, that's when the music stopped, so to speak. The events of that night. They're still shrouded in some mystery. But the fact remains that Spector was convicted of Clarkson's murder and spent the rest of his life in prison.
It's a tragic and disturbing end to a life filled with both incredible brilliance and devastating darkness. It leaves us with so many unanswered questions.
It does. It forces us to grapple with this uncomfortable reality that someone capable of creating such beautiful music could also be capable of such a horrific act. How do we reconcile the art with the artist in a case like this?
It's a question that has no easy answers. And it's not just about Phil Spector. This applies to so many figures throughout history: artists, writers, musicians, people who've created works of beauty and genius, but whose personal lives were marred by darkness and even cruelty.
You're absolutely right. It's a universal dilemma. And it challenges us to think critically about how we engage with art, especially when we learn these disturbing things about the creator. Can we separate the creation from the creator? Or are they forever intertwined?
It's a tough question to wrestle with, for sure. And it's one that we'll continue to explore in the final part of our deep dive. We've unpacked the rise of Phil Spector, his incredible musical achievements, and the dark side that ultimately led to his downfall. But where does that leave us in terms of appreciating his music? Can we still enjoy those iconic songs, knowing what we now know about the man who created them?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that each listener has to answer for themselves.
Well, it's been quite a journey, hasn't it? I mean, we've explored the highs and lows of Phil Spector's life, from the revolutionary wall of sound to the dark shadows that eventually consumed him. It's really left me thinking a lot about how we reconcile the man with the music.
Yeah, that's the real heart of it, isn't it? I mean, can you actually separate the art from the artist? Especially when the artist's actions are so, well, reprehensible. It's a question that really weighs heavily on Spector's legacy.
I think it's a question that goes beyond just Phil Spector, though. We see this dilemma pop up time and time again throughout history. How do we engage with art that was created by people who have done terrible things?
It's a valid point.
Yeah.
It's almost impossible to ignore the creator's actions once you know them. That knowledge just colors your perception of the art itself.
Yeah.
I mean, for some people, it might just taint the enjoyment completely. Like those catchy melodies might now evoke feelings of unease, knowing the darkness that really lurked behind them.
Yeah, I get that. Imagine listening to Be My Baby, one of the most joyful love songs ever written, and then having those happy memories, tinged with the knowledge of Spector's abusive behavior towards his wife. It's a really hard thing to shake.
Yeah, music is so closely tied to our emotions. It's like the soundtrack of our lives. And when that music is connected to someone capable of such harm, well, it can become a real source of conflict. Do you reject the art completely? Or do you try to compartmentalize appreciating the creation while still condemning the creator?
It's a really tough choice, and I honestly don't think there's a right or wrong answer. It's a personal journey for each listener. But maybe wrestling with this dilemma is part of the process. Maybe it forces us to think more critically about the art we consume and the impact it has on us.
Yeah, that's a really insightful way to look at it. It's not about sweeping things under the rug or pretending the artist's actions don't matter. It's about engaging in a deeper dialogue, recognizing those complexities and contradictions that often exist within artistic legacies.
Yeah, and maybe that's one of the takeaways from this deep dive. Phil Spector's story isn't just about the rise and fall of a music producer. It's a reminder that even the most brilliant minds can be flawed, and that those flaws can have devastating consequences. It's a reminder to look beyond the surface, to question, to analyze, and to engage with art in a way that really challenges our own perspectives.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
And I think it leaves us with a lot to ponder, doesn't it? How do we move forward knowing what we know? How do we balance appreciation for art with accountability for harm? These are questions worth considering as we continue to engage with the world around us.
Absolutely. And I think that's a good place to leave it for our listeners. We've taken this deep dive into Phil Spector's world, exploring his genius, his flaws, and the enduring legacy he left behind. Now it's up to you to grapple with those complexities and decide how you want to engage with his music and the larger questions that it raises.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating and thought-provoking exploration. Thanks for joining us on this journey.
Thanks for sharing your insights. And to our listeners, keep asking those tough questions, keep digging deeper, and keep those conversations going. Until next time, happy listening.
Okay, let's just finish this off. So that's me. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I hope that you... Wrong button. Let's come down here. Hope you enjoyed the presentation, and if you did enjoy the presentation, please remember to like and subscribe. And I hope you enjoy and know a little bit more about Phil Spector.